shining a light on the root cause of these crimes and introducing a spiritual solution. Justice will be served. Available at lulu.com in paperback or ebook.
It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Once you rat out all these people, you can go back into business and keep selling marijuana. And if you get pulled over, you just give me a call and I'll get you out of it.
Actually, before I got arrested, this DEA agent who I became quite friendly with, he testified at my trial in Maine. He was the guy who arrested me when I got busted up there in Maine. We had this long drive. I tell the whole story in the book. I call him Bernard Wolfsheen in the book. He was a really interesting guy. He reminded me of that guy on TV, Columbo. You know, he had kind of walked around with this like rumpled trench coat and was always acting like he was like, you know, absent-minded, but he was really brilliant. Jewish guy from Brooklyn, very smart. So he met me one time after I was leaving Mailer's apartment. He was outside. They were outside surveillance, and he and I had a talk on the promenade outside in Columbia Heights. And he basically made a pitch to me, which was, come to work for us. Nobody will ever know it. Stay out on the street. Continue to sell drugs. Just give us information. You know, because of the contacts you have, because of the world you work in, you can do this. You can make a lot of money, and we'll never bother you. They wanted me to become, you know, like a confidential informant that would be never have to testify at a trial, never have to wear a wire, but just continue to give them information over the years. And I'm sure that the main information they wanted information out of Lebanon. They wanted to know more about what was going on over there, particularly because a lot of heroin started to come out of that part of the world. So they made me that offer. And, you know, for a while, I mean, for like at least 3 or 4 minutes, I actually considered it.
Sure.
But, you know, I thought, man, is that really the life I want to lead, where I'm working for the government as some kind of a confidential informant and people are getting arrested and going to prison because of me? No. That's not the person I want to be. I don't want to be that guy. And then, you know, years later, I get arrested, and I'm in the county jail up in Maine, and my lawyer up there in Maine was a very well-connected lawyer who came to me one day, and he said, you know, I got a call from George Mitchell's office. Now, George Mitchell was the senator from Maine, and when I got arrested in Maine, it was the biggest, supposedly the biggest drug case in the history of the state. I don't know why, because there wasn't all that much product, but they made it out to be this huge international conspiracy, which it was. It was an international conspiracy. So they made me this offer. They said, basically, if you go back to Lebanon, they knew that I'd spent a lot of time in the Bekaa Valley, and that's where they were holding the hostages at that point. They offered me this deal. They said, if you go back there and help us to negotiate the release of these hostages, working for the government, we'll let this case go away, and we'll let all your problems go away. And we have money from Ross Perot. Ross Perot is willing to put up the money, $10 million or whatever we need to pay these hostages and get them out of Lebanon. And they made me that offer. And believe me, I was ready to say, yeah, I mean, I'll do that. But then what happened was they came back about 2 weeks later. My wife's been arrested up in Canada, and I wanted part of the deal for the Canadians to drop the charges too. And it became this whole negotiation where the Canadians were going to ultimately agree, but it took a while. And by the time we ended up reaching some kind of an agreement, they said, well, you know, it's too late. We already got this other guy to do it. And then it turns out that other guy actually ended up ripping them off. He was a real informant, a snitch, Lebanese guy. We got them over there to Lebanon. He took the money and split. You know, so there was a lot going on in the Middle East at that time with the hostages. CIA was over there. You know, it was a tremendous amount of intrigue, and the drug business and the terrorism and the arms trading were all kind of interconnected. And the government agents figured, if you got somebody who's a known hashish smuggler with a really good reputation in Lebanon, he's got a lot of control and a lot of power, which is true. And when I was in Beirut, I had armed bodyguards with me everywhere I went, and I was talking to people in government. You know, there was CIA people over there. There was a lot of Delta Force people over there. because of what was going on with the hostages at that time. So it was fascinating, but it was also very dangerous.
Do you plan on making a movie out of this?
Well, there's been some talk about a TV series. There's been a lot of talk about a TV series. I did a TV series that was on Showtime for 3 years called Street Time,
right,
which was based on my experiences on parole and what they call the Special Offenders Unit of a federal parole office, which always fascinated me because after I get out of prison, I was on what they call special parole. Now, what that means is that you got to report every week. You can't leave the 5 boroughs. Can't go anywhere without permission of your parole officer. They assume you're going to go back into illegal activity. You've been busted for what they call sophisticated criminal activity. So it's extremely hands-on, intense parole supervision. And it usually is for people who are either organized crime or people who have a history of dangerous criminal activity, like armed robberies of armored cars or banks, and some of these big-time burglars, and then people who have mental illness issues. Those are the people that end up in special offenders. They're always in special offenders, and it fascinated me, and I thought I ultimately came up with this idea to do a TV series about it, which was Street Time. It starred Rob Morrow and Terrence Howard, and went on for 3 years, and basically was about the parole officers and the parolees coming out of prison and how their lives would connect. And it's a really good show. So anyway, to get back to your question, I'm talking to people now about the possibility of doing a TV show that would tell the whole story of that so-called hippie mafia, and maybe even get into some of this other stuff that I was exposed to, being the connections between arms dealers and drug dealers and international terrorism.
Okay, now back to when you were in action in the 70s and the 80s and the 80s. Did you have any rip-offs? Did you ever get ripped off? Stuck up?
No,
okay.
Never did.
Any of your loads get ripped off though?
No.
Really?
Never lost a load. Never lost a load to the government, and never lost a load to any other smugglers. The only product loss that we had was from what we talked about earlier, spoilage.
Right.
There's 10 tons that was soaked in diesel fuel and bilge water, and then stuff like that would happen. I can remember once we had this big lodge that I owned up in Maine. There was one whole wing of it that was filled with pot that was just completely contaminated. We had to end up burying it. But never did, and I think largely that's because the people that I dealt with were all part of what I call the Hippie Mafia, and they knew each other, and they had good reputations. So I didn't deal with anybody that I didn't really know. And one of the things that I do talk about in the book is that at a certain point, the real mafia,
right,
the Italian mafia, tried to muscle in on my business.
No.
And they called me to a sit-down in Boston, and I met with a guy who introduced himself and said, "My name is Mike Capuana, rhymes with marijuana," and he wanted me to pay him $1 million in cash, and he wanted to take half of every load of hashish that I brought in through the air freight at Logan Airport. So that happened, and that became a very dangerous time for me, because when I refused to make that deal, this guy had a understanding with Raymond Patriarca, who is the boss of the whole New England crime family, that he was going to try to take over the soft drug business. Because what happened was, as I said earlier, the money started to become so big. There was so much money involved in the marijuana business during the 70s and 80s that the real mob tried to muscle in. And sometimes these gangsters had sons who were involved. So the gangsters tried to move in. And plus, when you're dealing with, the docks or airports, stuff like that, there's organized crime involved. And that's where Whitey Bulger came in, because one of the guys at the airport that I was paying off was an Irish guy who was connected to Whitey. So when the Italians came along and threatened to kill me if I didn't pay them $1 million, to start giving them half the load, which I refused to do. Then the Irish guy that I knew who worked in air freight was the one who hooked me up with Whitey, and I had a meeting with Whitey, told him the story, and he said, "Don't worry about it. I'll take care of it." And ultimately, he met with them, and it's written about in a couple of books where he basically, because he had more power in Boston than the Italians. Whitey's whole Irish mob was more powerful than the Italians, because nobody even dreamt at that point that he was also working for the FBI. I mean, if I had even thought that, I would have been, no, that's not a possibility. This is the most powerful gangster in New England, and he's also an FBI informant, but he was.
Well, let me ask you this, though, because it's a legitimate expense. If they control that airport, that they deserve to get paid for you using their airport. But why would Bulger get your pass on it?
Well, we were paying.
Oh, you were paying. Okay.
Yeah, we paid $30,000 every time.
Okay.
And the guys at the airport were happy with that.
Okay.
They were perfectly happy with it. And after I met with Whitey and told him the deal, he said, "Yeah, just, if you want to kick him up a little bit more money." And then he had a load of pot in Boston in South Boston, in a warehouse in South Boston, that he needed help selling. So I got my guys, and we sold the load. So yeah, it was reciprocal. I mean, they were, the thing about those guys is if you're a good earner, you're making money, they don't want to shut you down. It was just it was a power struggle. And once the Italians found out that I was connected with Whitey and this other guy, this Lebanese guy, they were like, "Oh, well, we didn't want to bother you. We're sorry. We didn't know that you were already paying these guys." So.
What about back to New York? Okay, when you had the Colombo family, the Scarpos. Okay, I guess they were bringing in Thai stick, and they had come into Staten Island. They took over everything on Staten Island very violently. Do you know anything about all that time?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
Greg Scarpa and his son Greg Jr.
Right.
They were a perfect example of what I talked about earlier, where you had these old-style mafiosos. And Greg Scarpa Sr. was a captain in the Colombo family, unbeknownst to everybody. He was also an informant for the FBI. But his son, Greg Jr., started opening up these spots, what they call these spots, where they were selling pot. And they tried to basically muscle in with the same kind of operation that the mob was using for other businesses, but it didn't really work in the pot business. It wasn't going to work in the pot business. Pot business has a whole different market. And because of the people who were involved, the people like me and the so-called Hippie Mafia, they had to come to us if they wanted to distribute a large amount of marijuana, because they didn't have the market. They had the market for heroin. They ultimately got the market for cocaine, too. But they didn't have the market for marijuana. And I believe that, well, now, of course, it's virtually legal, but they couldn't control it. And that was the one thing that was the advantage that we had. We controlled, because we built that market. There was no market before. Mostly it was college kids and Vietnam vets returning home. Those were the people, and guys like me, who were bringing it in, who ended up selling it all. I mean, the reason Boston was such a hub of activity was because there were so many colleges up there. And there were people who were financing their college educations by dealing pot.
But they were able to come to Staten Island. They took over the College of Staten Island. They took over Wolf's Pond Park, two major. These were like supermarkets, and they came and they took over. But now my question is, though, they were bringing in their own product. They were bringing in this Thai stick through containers. They were bringing in that themselves, or were you involved in that?
No, I was not involved in that, and I don't know who was. I mean, the people that I knew who were bringing in Thai sticks were mostly West Coast people.
Okay.
They were bringing it into either to Vancouver or to Seattle and San Francisco. Big loads of Thai sticks and Cambodian pot, Thai pot, and Vietnamese pot coming in. A lot of those guys were vets too, were Vietnam vets who didn't spend time in that part of the world. And now that pot that comes from that part of the world is actually the indica pot, which is always my favorite. I've always preferred indica pot. I find it much more intellectually stimulating. And
does Thai stick still exist? Do people still get that?
That's a good question, man.
Yeah.
Good question.